are just joining us, I am Lauren Van Hemert and from RDU on Stage, and I'm very excited to be sitting with Misha Berson, who retired from the Seattle Times, but wrote for the Seattle Times as a theater critic for 27 years. Yes. And then 10 years before that in San Francisco. So definitely has seen a lot of theater. And I feel like you're based in Seattle, correct?
Yes.
So one question I have is, Seattle is kind of where this whole virus seemed to start. It didn't really start in Seattle, but in this country, we became aware of it.
Yes.
When those first cases in Seattle. So talk to me a little bit about the arts community, the theater scene there. How are things faring out there? How are the companies doing?
Well, it's been just a terrible blow to theaters around the country, of course. And Seattle has had a very vital theater scene for a long time. Mm-hmm. There are, about 10 or 11 equity companies here, including our flagship theater, Seattle Repertory Theater, but many others. And it's, I think that they all held out hope somehow at the beginning of this, because the early cases of COVID were in a nursing home in Kirkland, Washington, which is just across a bridge from Seattle, across Lake Washington. And I think there was some hope, as horrible as that situation was, that it would be kind of confined there. And when it wasn't, when things got worse and worse, the theaters who kept, saying, well, we may not open this month, maybe we'll open next month, maybe we'll do our summer season, maybe we'll do, one by one, they had to obey the restrictions that our excellent governor put on us, and stay at home, and also, no gatherings of more than, I think it was 5 people at the beginning. And so it's been a real crushing blow for the Seattle theater scene. I think, there are many of the smaller companies may survive more easily in a way than the bigger ones, because they didn't have a big payroll. They didn't have, $1 million budget. It's been very tragic to see the biggest repertory theater in the country, Oregon Shakespeare Festival, which is in Ashland, Oregon. It's 9 hours from Seattle, but many, many people in Seattle and many actors and technicians have worked there, that they had to completely close their entire year out. And so it's hard. We also don't have a huge amount of public money here. We have a very low support level from the state of Washington, sadly. And many theater companies really relied heavily on box office. So, I just think that everybody is hoping for the best, raising as much money as they can, trying to get those small business loans, and, hoping that by the fall or early next year, they'll be able to get back in business.
And in addition to the arts community, one thing I've been struck by is that a lot of our newspapers are furloughing the writers are being furloughed. And a lot of our colleagues are being furloughed around the country. How have you seen theater criticism evolve since you've been writing theater criticism? And then are we at a moment where our role as arts journalists is going to change, or the way we deliver content is going to change?
I think that's been a slow moving I want to say train wreck, but I'm hoping it'll be just evolution if I put a happier spin on it. Really, when I was hired by the Seattle Times, and I worked for 10 years before that as the theater critic for the San Francisco Bay Guardian, a really wonderful weekly, which no longer exists, part of the loss of those smaller papers. But I felt very fortunate to get a full-time job as a critic at that point, because that was in the middle of a recession in the early 90s. And, of course, it makes that look like nothing. But in the first few years I was there, things were delicate financially. Then things seemed to be better. And I think that nobody in our business and daily journalism could have foreseen, what has happened, that the web, for all of its good qualities and access, greater access to many voices, really completely wiped out our advertising. And I don't think anybody realized how much daily newspapers depended on classified ads. That was the bulk of our advertising and our revenue. So by the time I left, the arts coverage, the arts staff had shrunk from a high of 10 or 12 people when I was there in the early 2000s to, I think there are 3 art staff members now, and they're clinging on, and just watching one by one the Oregonian in Portland, just cut off its full-time art staff completely. So it's been a crushing blow for our colleagues, and I'm really happy that some very good things have emerged on the web. In Portland, there's a terrific site called OregonArtsWatch.com, which I have written for occasionally from Seattle. And that is made up of people who used to work at the Oregonian. 2 former arts editors of the Oregonian are the editors there. And, there are other really good sites, but it is just, very, very difficult to earn a full-time living as an arts journalist now, as you know. And
I know that.
and I have to explain to people that, that the theater critics and theater journalists are part of the ecosystem. They're part of, it's not like, we're over on one side and the artists are over there. We are the people who are writing about it, documenting it, in some ways publicizing it, though, it's not our job to tell everybody how great it is all the time. And more than that, to keep a dialogue about theater as an important live art form going. That's our part in the ecosystem of theater. And when that goes away or is diminished, or there's no more life as a profession where people get better at it and don't come to it but learn and stay with it for a long time and become more seasoned critics and journalists, it's a real loss. It's a real loss to the greater art scene. I mean, that's self-serving to say that, but I truly believe it.
Well, and in the evolution of all of these websites, I went to school for journalism, and at that time, the Holy Grail was to work for a newspaper and see your work in print. And now the newspapers are slowly disappearing off, the face of the earth, it seems like. And a lot of us are turning to online publications or creating our own online publications, which is a good thing. However, with the advent of the web, anybody can be a theater critic. You don't need to
Yeah.
have a degree like you or I might have. You can just start a blog and write your opinion. And I feel like everybody deserves to have that freedom of speech, freedom of opinion. But there's a difference between expressing an opinion and giving a critique of a work. And that's where it's tricky for me.
Well, what I've told students when I've taught classes and workshops in arts criticism is that, like everything else, the more you know about your subject matter, the better you are, and the more you've seen, the better you become. One of the first things I always say to young people who are interested in arts criticism of any kind, film or music. I've written also about film and music, not as much, but it interests me to write about a variety of things. You have to just bombard yourself with reading, with going. I mean, one of the most important experiences in my life as an arts writer was going to European theater festivals. Not everybody has the means or the freedom to do that, but I got to see a world of theater. I got to see the potential of contemporary theater that was experimental. I got to see the classics done with tremendous actors and a lot of funding in places like England. And those things really helped inform me. And if you don't have that, you can be overly enthusiastic sometimes about things and dismissive sometimes about things, which demand a little more, knowledge, more awareness. So that's what that's the thing that I really stress with younger critics is, I didn't really understand Hamlet till I saw it 5 times, and saw the differences between how people did it. And whereas, you might see Hamlet the first time and think, either this is the worst play ever written, or this is, this actor is the best Hamlet that ever was. So it's an education. And I think the critics I admire the most have tried to constantly be learning in any way they could to expand their understanding.
And I totally agree with that. And I feel very fortunate that we know each other. Our connection is through the American Theater Critics Association. Yeah. And I feel very fortunate that we have that collection of artists and writers who are, we meet one time a year, a couple times a year, depending on the year. And it's nice to have that fellowship and to be able to, I think, learn from each other. I have certainly learned a lot from the membership and from being a member of this organization.
I've really urged anyone who is serious about doing this to join. And it's funny because, writing, especially if you're writing for your own website or, you're writing as a freelancer, you don't have a lot of colleagues around you. You don't have a lot of people to talk about things with that only other theater critics would find interesting, probably. And so that fellowship is great. And also, we've done a lot as an organization, I think, to try to encourage further learning, further education. And one of the ways is through those conferences we have, where you can go to another city. The city's really happy to have a whole bunch of arts critics there. They treat you very nicely. You get to see a lot of theater that you wouldn't see in another place with other actors and directors. And that's just another way of expanding, your view.
Absolutely. Well, I really want to talk about West Side Story. So we're going to transition to your book, and I'm going to get into this since
Just
my
happen to have the copy right here. Of course, it'll look different.
okay, so there's the book. Look how
The writing
beautiful
will
the book
look wrong, but
and I've ordered my copy, but I did not get it in time.
oh, that's
But I will be reading this book because I love this musical so much. But I'm going to start by sharing a picture, which for our North Carolina audiences gets me very excited. So this is a production photo from the upcoming Steven Spielberg
yes.
West Side Story. This is North Carolina's own Ariana DeBose, who's just so hot right now. She's just everywhere, it seems like, but she received her training when she was a kid here in North Carolina on our stages. And to be honest with you, as a theater lover who is navigating this pandemic and missing theater desperately, when I see pictures like that, or I see a trailer for the In the Heights movie, which I know has been postponed, the release date, but those trailers, these production photos, the news of Hamilton now coming on Disney Plus, which happened yesterday, this is what's given people life right now through this pandemic. People who love the arts like you and I do. So why write a book about West Side Story? What is your connection to West Side Story, and why that musical and not Sound of Music or some other show?
Well, the book is called Something's Coming, Something Good, West Side Story and the American Imagination. And I'll explain the subtitle in a moment. But like many people, West Side Story was a touchstone for me. First, I actually saw it or excerpts of it as a child because it came through on national tour to Detroit, where I was growing up at the time. And this was right after the Broadway version. So I was really young, and I was captivated by it immediately. And the soundtrack, I love the original cast album. We had it, we played it. And in the foreword to my book, I talk about how my cousin Rochelle and I used to play. We used to pretend we were in West Side Story, and that who was Riff and who was Tony and who was who was Maria. Neither of us wanted to be Maria. We wanted to be gang members. And it captured the imagination, I think, of so many people. And I was too young to understand really the sociological aspects of it. In 1957, when it opened, it really was very unclear that this would be a hit. And I can talk a little bit more about why that was so. But it turned out that we were approaching the 50th anniversary of West Side Story. And I had a friend who knew someone at a publishing company, Hal Leonard Inc. They had an imprint called Applause, which does theater books. And I said, I just had this sudden idea. It's coming up to the 50th anniversary. I don't know of any books about it. There was one book, one kind of slim volume. It's actually very good, by a Canadian writer. And he had done, books kind of looking into the background of a number of important musicals. But I wanted to do something more expansive. And fortunately, the folks at Applause, it took a long time. They said no. And then, a year later or something, they came back to me and said, you still want to do this? I had a very short time. I mean, I had less than a year, which was really hard. And sometimes I look at the book and I think, oh God, if I'd only had 3 years, it would have been so much better. But I plunged into research. And one of the reasons I wanted to do it was that I had seen a production at the Fifth Avenue Theater in San Francisco. And the Fifth Avenue is a very large, very distinguished house, which has over 2,000 seats. Their seasons are both their own productions and things that they bring in, Broadway tours like Jersey Boys and so on. And they really have a commitment to doing these older shows beautifully. They do new work too. So for the first time, I saw a live production of West Side Story with 25 people in the cast, 20 people in the orchestra pit, the way it was meant to be done, right? You know, full orchestrations. They also had a choreographer who had worked with Robbins and who goes around the world reproducing his choreography. And there are a number of people like this who do this, who were trained by Robbins. And so I thought, wow, this is going to be so interesting. You know what? Because I had seen it several times and I had thought, oh, it's dated. It doesn't really, you know, I wasn't knocked out by it. And this production was so good. I mean, it was exciting and it was very well produced, you know, and it had a wonderful Tony, a beautiful Maria. I mean, it had everything in place. It had a dance company from Seattle doing the choreography, so it had fabulous dancers. And I thought, okay, I get it. You know, I get it. I'd seen the movie. I loved some of the movie, and I understood why, as a live show, it was so vital. So that was another trigger for me to write the book. And then when I started delving into the history of the show, oh, it's fascinating. You know, it really is. There's so much there.
Well, let's start at the beginning of the evolution of the show, because I do find it interesting. Originally, Jerome Robbins had come up with this concept, and they were going to call it East Side Story. And it was going to revolve around the conflict between rival Catholic and Jewish groups. And I guess my question here is, if that was the story that ended up materializing, obviously it wasn't, and it took them 10 years to work it out and
yeah.
what we know of it now. But if that was what we ended up with, that rival between the Jewish and the Catholic groups, would we still be talking about it 72 years later?
Well, let me say that the four men who were responsible for creating this show, and at first it was just three. It was Jerome Robbins, who at that point was choreographer, very exciting young choreographer who had done some work with his friend Leonard Bernstein, the ballet Fancy Free that then became On the Town, and then they had done Wonderful Town. And then that was, you know, they were like the core of this. And, you know, I'm just looking at the book here because I just want to get my years right, since I don't, it's kind of hard for me to remember every single thing. But it was 1948 when Robbins first had this idea. And the idea came in part from his friendship with Montgomery Clift, who was doing a scene at the Actors Studio, you know, the Method Actors Studio, to play Romeo. And he asked Robbins to direct him in this scene. And Robbins had all kinds of ideas about how to do that. And basically was saying to him, well, imagine that you are, you know, Romeo, and you're in this gang now, you know, because after World War II, that was when the whole street gang thing, the modern street gang thing really started heating up. And so they got involved with Arthur Lawrence, a young playwright who had just had a big hit on Broadway called Home of the Brave. Mm-hmm. And they thought of this idea. And I think part of the reason is that they were all Jewish men, all three of them, all Jewish men who grew up in New York and knew New York. And so that was kind of their reference point. But what they discovered after actually writing a lot, I mean, there's a whole archive of their memos back and forth, their letters, all the collaboration that was going on. And they were all working on other projects too. They decided that, well, this is kind of ridiculous to do this as a modern story, because that enmity between Italians and Jews wasn't really between gangs, you know, and that kind of ended back in, you know, the teens. So, you know, what was more contemporary? So they dropped it, and they dropped it for a few years. And it was only after Lawrence and Bernstein were in LA doing something else, and they saw this newspaper talking about gang warfare in LA with Chicano gangs, that they suddenly, you know, kind of clicked. Why don't we do this about Latino gangs and white gangs? And that actually made more sense, because there were Latino gangs, Puerto Rican gangs in at the time. There were certainly white European gangs. There were a lot of actually Irish gangs, Irish American gangs. So I don't think they knew that it wouldn't work. They wouldn't have done it. So we wouldn't have seen it, because they were all astute enough, you know, to know, that's not going to fly.
And once they kind of, it sounds like once they kind of came to the realization to do it with the Latino gangs versus the Anglo gangs, whatever those Anglo gangs look like, that it came together very quickly. It didn't come together quickly from East Side Story to West Side Story, but it did once they kind of came to that decision.
Well, it was a matter of years, but yes, that was the, you know, that was the creative, you know, lighter fluid they needed or something to keep it going. And once that happened, and I think this is often the case with really great artists, once they find, you know, that spark, it really, you know, can build into a fire. So they worked very hard together again. And you've got to remember, I have a list in the book of all the things they did between, you know, between 1949 and when the show actually debuted in 1957. It includes, I mean, I'm not going to read it to you, but, you know, Bernstein composed and Robbins directed Wonderful Town. Robbins directed and choreographed The Pajama Game. Bernstein wrote the soundtrack for On the Waterfront. You know, it just went on and on, the things that they did. Bernstein also became the maestro of the New York Philharmonic, which was a huge job. So they were all running around doing all kinds of things. The fourth piece of the puzzle was finding a lyricist. At first, Bernstein tried to write the lyrics himself for his own songs, and his colleagues had to say, no. And there are you know, copies of the lyrics that he wrote for Maria and other things, and no, they were very romantic and, you know, poetic, but they just weren't right. So they actually asked and thought of quite a few different lyricists, mostly Comden and Green, who of course were wonderful, and they had done all kinds of shows by then. And they decided, no, that isn't quite right. And then Arthur Lawrence was at a party where Stephen Sondheim, who was a young man and being mentored by Oscar Hammerstein, family friend, was sitting at the piano playing, and he had this brainstorm, why not Stephen Sondheim? So you've got to remember that these guys are about 10 years older than Sondheim at the time. He's still in his 20s. He had never done a Broadway show. He'd done a little bit here and there. He'd written a couple of musicals, but he was really untried.
Mm-hmm.
But they knew, this is genius attracts genius, I think. And these guys knew that this man had something special. And I think the show would have been very different if Sondheim hadn't been the fourth member. Because as young as he was and as green as he was so smart, so astute, that he really had, some power in how things progressed. They argued like cats and dogs, and they, but they always came to some kind of agreement.
I love that. And I love that he was so young. We take it for granted that he's this powerhouse composer now, just celebrated his 90th birthday, but he wasn't, everybody had to start somewhere. He just happened to start with
West Side Story.
West Side Story.
Not a bad way to start. Yeah. I actually talked to him, and he was quite wonderful. He's anybody who's read his books, he wrote a couple of books actually for the same publisher that I wrote this one for. And he's very self-critical. And like, for example, he hates, some of the lyrics that he wrote for West Side Story. He doesn't like "I Feel Pretty." He thinks the famous quote about that is that he thought that it made Maria sound like she was in an old Coward play. It's alarming how charming I feel. But some of those lyrics are so memorable, and he had a lot of confidence. He had a lot of, maybe I shouldn't even call it chutzpah, he was not a shrinking violet, so there was a way in which they treated him as an equal, and he acted like an equal. And thank heaven. And then he went on to work again. Arthur Lawrence wrote Gypsy, and he did the lyrics for Gypsy, and that was directed by Robbins. So, from one fabulous musical to the next.
And thank goodness for us. What a legacy that's left, all of that work, not just West Side Story.
Yes.
In your book, you spend a lot of time analyzing the music and the lyrics, which I love. This is what I love about your books, is when it really gets into the nitty gritty and analyzes music, inspiration, musical lyrics. When I read Carol Degier's book about Stephen Schwartz and the creation of Godspell, she talks about musical diving boards, the springboards of inspiration from which Stephen Schwartz works. And when she talked about that, and she mentioned some of his inspirations, if you go back and you listen to the Godspell cast album, you can really hear it, not as copying another artist, but you can hear where the idea came from, where the spark came from. So I did read that you mentioned they were Jewish. Bernstein used a lot of his Jewish heritage and some of the shofar rhythms as a point of reference for some of the music in West Side Story. Can you talk about those musical diving boards for them?
Well, the shofar reference was to, the first thing you hear in West Side Story is ba-da-dum.
Mm-hmm.
And those notes mimic the notes that you blow on the shofar at Rosh Hashanah, which is, the Jewish New Year. And in the temple every year, somebody blows on a ram's horn and blows those notes. So that was the main thing. It's funny because one of the a negative review that my book got was from somebody in a Jewish publication who just raked me over because I missed like the hundreds of what he felt were the hundreds of quotes and inspirations from Jewish music that Bernstein had, and I don't know if he was projecting some of them or not, but I did miss them. But you've got to remember that Bernstein was very deeply devoted to the classics as well as contemporary music. So there are elements in his music for this score and others that come from Aaron Copland, for instance, somebody who he knew, loved very much and admired. The other thing that I found kind of wonderful was his real adoration of Spanish and Latin music. He had spent time, his wife was from South America, and he had spent a lot of time in South America. He had also been in the Caribbean, and he loved that music. And, some of the dancing that goes on, dance to the gym, there's all kinds of, quotations and elements that relate to Latin music. So that was something else. And then there are, in the Somewhere ballet, you get much more of a Copland feel, much more of a kind of orchestral classical feel. And then he also loved jazz. He loved modern jazz. And so you get little bits of music that really sound like modern jazz. And at the beginning, there's a heavy use of a saxophone that sounds like a jazz saxophone. Cool, that song has a real jazz flavor. So I think he brought to it a great many influences because he was such a Renaissance person in terms of music. He loved all kinds of music. He didn't stick to his classical lane.
Which is, I think, what made him so brilliant. That's really that's his musical genius. I think none of it sounds the same. It's not just formulaic. You don't, like a lot of artists you hear are. So yeah, he was pretty brilliant. Why did
Yeah, go ahead.
Why did they think the show wouldn't succeed when it opened? Why weren't they sure it would be a success?
Well, that was because of the content. You have to remember that this was a period when American musicals were mainly musical comedies. They were romantic musical comedies, and some of them were just, tremendously successful and still are kind of classic works of art in that vein. People are always kind of surprised when I tell them that The Music Man beat West Side Story for the Tony Award, and not just one. I mean, it kind of swept the Tony Awards. The year before had been the year of My Fair Lady, so that we're talking about that kind of thing. There had been some serious musicals, Lost in the Stars, musical that was based on the South African book Cry the Beloved Country, and a few others along the way. Langston Hughes wrote a musical called Street Scene. But by and large, the great American musical was a happy, upbeat thing. So this is Romeo and Juliet. All these young people die. The show ends with one of the three male protagonists dead on the stage after the other two have died. I think that also you've got to remember how racially unintegrated American show business was at the time. In recent times, I think, the creators have gotten a lot of flack for not having more collaborators who are Latino, for not having more of the cast be Puerto Rican. But what they did was very revolutionary at the time. The fact that they even, had a show about Puerto Ricans where the characters were sympathetic Puerto Ricans. You really cared about what happened to Bernardo and Anita and Maria. So there were those, things that just didn't seem commercial at all. And then the music sounded strange. The fact that a lot of the drama is conveyed through dance, that did not happen. That was another thing that was really new. And one of the great gifts of West Side Story is that every dance number is a dramatic number. Tells you something more about what's going on, about the characters, involves life and death as well as love. So all those things were kind of, well, how do we raise money on this? And the story goes that their original producer, took them around to all the rich angels who usually backed Broadway plays at the time. And they would come and they would sing some songs and they would tell the story and do a little backers audition. They didn't get a penny from those people. And it was only when, they finally found oh my God, just went out of my head. Hal Prince. Hal Prince was a young producer, just starting out on his own. He was a friend of Stephen Sondheim's, and he said, they had the cast lined up, they had rehearsals ready, and they didn't have a dime. And if Hal Prince had not come forward with his partner, and they were young and kind of got it, said, we like this, we're going to find the money, and made some calls and got the money, the show wouldn't have happened.
And back then, you didn't need nearly as much money as you need now. So can you imagine?
No.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Let's, and
by the way, I wanted to say one last thing. The reviews of West Side Story, which I quote, some people recognized it as a really thrilling, very new and important musical. And a fair number of critics thought it was too violent. Who cares about these people? Or they even got a bad review from a much more progressive critic, Harold Clurman, who thought it was like a bunch of rich Broadway people slumming and writing cliches about poor folk. So they kind of they did get some very good reviews, and people really loved the show who came to see it, but it was not a slam dunk. It was very much an edgy thing, whether it would even come across people.
I want to talk about the casting of West Side Story, and this is where so much of the prior to this recent revival, which has so much controversy all by itself.
Oh yeah,
we'll talk about that in a minute. But
I saw it.
Prior to that, most of the controversy with West Side Story had to do with casting. I'm a very visual person, so I need to show the visuals. So here's from the 1957 production, Carol Lawrence.
No, this is from, on the left is you're right, I'm sorry.
Carol Lawrence was Maria, and she was an Italian-American, and then of course the movie version, Natalie Wood portrayed Maria, and
Rita Moreno
was brilliant, won an Academy Award for her portrayal of Anita. But even she had to darken her skin with makeup and that kind of thing. And Natalie Wood was Russian American. Her ancestry was from Russia, not Latin community. So
Yeah.
talk to me about the whitewashing of a West Side Story, as some have dubbed it. And
Yeah, I mean,
is that
I think you have to look. You really have to look in context. And I'm in the weird position of defending this. I don't defend the movie because I think they did some things that were really, commercial decisions that made no sense. But Robbins wanted to have more Latinos in the cast. He genuinely wanted to, and he looked. He did. He would go to neighborhood dances and Puerto Rican clubs, and looking for people who he could audition, and who he wanted very much for them to be as authentic as possible. At that point, there was very poor access, especially on the East Coast, of for people of color to get the kind of training and experience that were required, and they were really required in this show. The actors in this show had to dance, and with the exception of Maria and Tony, they had to really dance. And here was this very, very exacting Broadway choreographer who was also a classical ballet choreographer, who put people through their paces. There's all kinds of stories about what a general he was, and how sometimes he was kind of cruel. But dancers expected that in a way. It's a very disciplined art form. And he simply could not find the people he needed. And I don't believe that was just an excuse. I believe that if you said that today, I'd say, no, that's lame. But in the 1950s, I absolutely believe it. He was very lucky in Chita Rivera, who played Anita originally. Chita Rivera was Puerto Rican, and she was mostly playing like French people and stuff. I mean, they didn't have any Latino characters for her to play, Latina characters for her to play. But she was brilliant and had everything he needed. But he could not find. I think there were, as the show progressed, and it was done, of course, in London, it was done in other places, and then there were Broadway revivals. He always tried to have more and more Latino performers in there. When they got to Hollywood, it was a commercial thing. And I have a list in there of some of the women that they, considered for the part of Maria, and it's very funny. I mean, Suzanne Plachette is in there, and all kinds of people. And Natalie Wood desperately wanted to do this. There's a new documentary about Natalie Wood on HBO, and there's a little bit about it there. She also wanted to sing it, and somebody saved a track of her singing, and nope, get Marnie Nixon on the phone. And he was able to take some of the cast some of the people who had done West Side Story on stage as gang members, and that was great. But he really had very little control over who was going to play the main characters. And even Elvis' manager inquired about him playing Tony. So, I can't defend it. I think it was a terrible mistake. It's one of the things about the film that makes me cringe. I think both Tony and Maria were very much miscast. Natalie Wood tried very hard. I mean, she put her heart and soul in this, and she became very close to Robbins. And when he was fired from the film, she continued to meet with him and to, engage him and get coaching from him. But she was just, not the person who should be playing Maria. One other thing I want to say about the movie, though, and it's going to be interesting to compare it to the Spielberg movie, is that the movie in many ways, except for the casting, is Robbins' original show. The choreography is all him. And I don't think there's, and I love Fred Astaire and all kinds of other film choreographers. I don't think there are any dance sequences in film that can match some of the dancing in West Side Story. And even though Ernest Lehman was credited with the screenplay, he took it right out of Lawrence's screenplay. Even though somebody else arranged the music in a certain way, it's Bernstein's music. So when you see that musical film, it is, you know, those four geniuses are behind it. Mm-hmm. And it's the best we have of a reproduction of that Broadway show.
And until maybe this next incarnation.
Well, that won't be a reproduction because you've got Tony Kushner writing the screenplay, who wrote Angels in America, and I love Tony. Pardon me?
And different choreography, different.
Yeah, and you know, I really love Tony. I love him as a friend, and also I just think he cares about the show. He took it very personally. I know he's made some changes, and I think they might be, you know, good ones. And then you have another choreographer, a young choreographer from New York City Ballet, which is, you know, was Robbins' company, who is, you know, going to do what he's going to do. Mm-hmm. And you have a much more racially integrated cast. You have almost, you know, a great deal of it is going to be filmed on sites rather than in the studio. So, but it will be it will be West Side Story, but it will be Spielberg's West Side Story, as this last revival on Broadway was very much Ivan van Hove's West Side Story.
So let's talk about that. That's where we're going next. So there's
I know we get to that. Did you see it?
I did not see it. And I don't mind the reimagining of classic works. I think there's room for that. But my problem with the revival of Oklahoma, and I imagine it might have been my same problem with this revival of West Side Story, is when you lose sight of the source material so much that it's almost unrecognizable. And that was my problem with the revival of Oklahoma. That's why I didn't like it, is that I felt it just veered too far away from the source material. In this particular case, and I want to tease out the dancing and the music, but in this particular case, they did change some of the lyrics to the song America because they used the movie lyrics I read instead of some of the.
Yeah, and that was with Sondheim's permission. He likes the movie lyrics better.
Yes, and they cut the song I Feel Pretty. Mm-hmm. Can you even have West Side Story without I Feel Pretty? I mean, to me, I don't know. So tell me about the revival and the changes. And
my concern about the revival was, you know, I try to go into every show with that, you know, idea of astonish me. You know, I want it to succeed. And the problem for me was not that they did something different. It was that they did something different that wasn't better and wasn't as good. If they had a fresh take on it that, you know, that knocked my socks off, I would have said, great. You know, this thing is not cast in stone. It's going to live. It's going to be changed by generations. I think the biggest problem for a lot of people who did not like it, and I have good friends who are critics who were very knocked out by it. They really liked it a lot more than me. Was that they did these supersized videos, and they were live videos, most of them. So the actors are on stage and there are video cameramen, weaving around them. And the stage is bare except for this giant screen. And the videos were so large that the people became very small, the actual real life people. And it was the dimensions were very disorienting and not to a purpose that I understood. The other thing was that he kind of fetishized the gang members. They were all very tattooed and very muscular and very beautiful. And so there were a lot of like huge videos of these guys with their biceps and their tattoos and their earrings. And, and it was like saying over and over again, these people are young and beautiful and they're contemporary because they're tattooed and it became kind of a cliche, that and so I think those were the two things that were the hardest for me to take, that there was something very pretentious about these posing, leering guys. You didn't get a sense of who they were as characters. And there are characters there. I mean, they're not all well developed, but certainly Riff is, and Arab, and a couple of the other gang members. And then this whole business with kind of diminishing the live actors in a way that just didn't make sense to me. It felt very gimmicky, and it just continued in that vein. And I wasn't clear what the purpose was. I wasn't clear what he was saying beyond, this is contemporary. This is a modern version of West Side Story. The other thing that he did, which I actually found wrong, just in terms of the story and very cliched in its own right, was that when in the Officer Krupke number, when they're all singing this very satirical song that still is kind of biting satire of the juvenile court psychiatric prison complex and how young people get caught up in that. I mean, that's happening now, Mm. In the background, they had films of, what was that? They had videos of young black men being harassed, beaten by police, taken into the jail system, behind bars. It completely wiped out the satirical commentary. It all became about, the police brutality against mostly, Black young men. And while that is, a burning issue that has to be addressed culturally and just socially, it was, it didn't gel with the show. It just didn't make sense with that number. There was no irony in it at all. And at that point, it was very hard to take the show seriously. It just felt like it was one sort of, I don't know, gimmick after another. Now, again, I'm one of those people who just turned off to it. And I know other people who found it very refreshing and very exciting. And I'm happy for that.
It was very polarizing, for sure. And within the theater community.
And I really wanted it to be good. Also, it had a wonderful cast. It had a, terrific Tony, young man was, could sing Maria, which is 3 octaves and really hard, and lovely young woman as Maria. It had a good, everybody could dance really well. And I just felt like, they were diminished by the artifice. I wanted to see them in a different production of the show.
Well, and I want to talk a little bit about the dance in that show, the choreography.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard for me to wrap my brain around any other person choreographing this show other than Jerome Robbins, although I know it's going to happen with the Spielberg movie, and I know I'm going to have to get over it. But I enjoy seeing productions where they have a nod, at least, to Robbins' original choreography. Give me a little bit of it. Give me a little bit of an homage. And I'm going to share a screen because one of the most beautiful productions I saw here in North Carolina
lovely. Yeah.
Was Eric Woodall's.
Cool. Yeah.
I'm going to say it's Eric Woodall's West Side Story. Eric Woodall was with Tara Rubin Casting in New York for 14 years and recently moved back to North Carolina to become the producing artistic director of North Carolina Theater. And he directed this production of West Side Story last year. And for my money, this was one of the most gorgeous shows last year. It was a little contemporary without losing sight of the source material. It was beautifully done. The jets were all in black. The sharks were all in white. It just was a visual masterpiece, I thought. So I wanted to share this picture because it's indicative of the dance and how strong it was in the show. It was not the original choreography. It was a new choreographer and he did a very good job, but you could see the reverence for Jerome Robbins in this new show, this new production. In the revival, they brought in, I think, Beyonce's choreographer to choreograph.
Well, it was Anna Teresa de Keersmacher, who is actually a very famous Belgian postmodern choreographer. But her style and her outlook, her philosophy was quite different than Robbins. And actually, there was a story in that long New York Times piece about the show as it evolved, that for the dance at the gym, she didn't use any of the the Latino references and the kind of Latin dancing references. And apparently the cast members, the Puerto Rican cast members and other Latino cast members were very unhappy about it. And she actually brought in another Latino choreographer to help her, which is kind of interesting because for that number, Robbins brought in Peter Gennaro to help him with that number. Peter Gennaro, I think Italian American, but still, he knew that wasn't his exact forte either. So with the exception of that number, what you got in de Keersmacher's choreography was much less of the fireworks that you get with Bernstein, much less of the balletic stuff, and a much more repetitive style. She's very interested in how people move normally, what.
Misha, I may have lost you. Misha, can you still hear me? We're frozen. Misha, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay. I lost you for a second. I kind of lost you for a second.
It was the internet.
That's okay. So you were saying her choreography was much more.
She's interested in how sort of normal movement patterns, I'm really, minimizing this. I mean, I'm really, just oversimplifying it, can be turned into a kind of natural form of dancing. And with Robbins, you get much more show dancing, you get much more fireworks, you get these incredible kicks and things and there was a little bit of that in there. And when it had to do the job dramatically, I think her choreography did. Most importantly, in the scene of the Rumble, which, by the way, was done with all this rain pouring down, and that added some extra drama. I don't know. I found that a little bit gimmicky too, but it was interesting seeing them all sloshing around and fighting with each other. So again, I just thought that, she didn't bring something to it that was more interesting and more inviting and engaging than his choreography, and I think, again, a lot of different choreographers have worked on that show. It's done all the time in Europe and Japan, in South America, and it's not always done with his choreography.
So when it comes to, and you write, I know you talked about this in a few interviews, this really is a global musical, probably in the same way that,
Oops.
Oh, can you hear me still?
Yeah.
Okay. In the same way that maybe Sound of Music is kind of a global, internationally known, loved musical. Are there other musicals that you can point to that have this kind of global reference, global?
I don't know. I mean, musical theater is one of America's great exports, Broadway musical theater. It's beloved all over the world. I mean, I have clips of, I have a little Facebook page of my own called West Side Story Book. And, I just put it up clips that I like of things. And, I mean, I see Estonian versions with kids singing it, all the songs in Estonian. The Germans just, go berserk. Everybody's in leather and, outer space kind of looking hairdos. And I don't know. I mean, I think that there are a lot of musicals, and people love things like Les Mis. They, all over the world, and they've toured. ABBA musicals have been all over the world. But I think there's something about West Side Story that is deeper than just it's a great musical. I think it's about, frankly, Shakespeare. I think it's about that story of love and death among young people and strife among young people. That's powerful, because even with all my criticism of this last Broadway production, and my disappointment in it, I was moved at the end because it's moving. When you see what happens to these young people who cannot get along and who wind up killing each other. And I think that along with all the other wonderful things and fun things and, the kind of joyousness of some of the show, I think that makes it special. The other thing is that it's done so often in high schools and colleges. That alone is going to keep it alive for a long time. I asked Sondheim which of his shows are done the most, and he surprised me by saying Sweeney Todd, because apparently after the movie and the gruesomeness of Sweeney Todd really appealed to a lot of young people. But I think among the musicals that he participated in, I think it must be West Side Story, because there have been many thousands productions of it. And somehow that story, just like Shakespeare in general, translates across, every nationality, every culture.
And what's so interesting to me about West Side Story is so many of these musicals, like I'll point to Carousel, and there's a few others from that era of musicals. You had mentioned Music Man, My Fair Lady. Some of these shows don't age well. they don't play well to contemporary audiences.
Yeah.
I know Carousel is viewed as a particularly problematic show now, even though they did that beautiful revival a year or two ago.
Yeah.
But West Side Story, I told you before we went on air, I took my kids to see the movie 2 years ago when they brought it into the Fathom events in the movie theater. And my kids were completely engaged. And it struck me how, although the movie is dated in what they're wearing and in some of the street scenes that you're looking at, it really has aged well. The themes are very contemporary feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And also it was produced very well. I mean, the scenes on the street in New York where they shot it, oh my gosh. I mean, that's why he got fired, because he spent so much time on those scenes in blistering hot summer weather. It's exciting, but I do also think it's about young people. It's about young people, and sadly, young people often are at each other's throats. I mean, we still do have gangs. One of the things that's very interesting is that West Side Story has been used quite often as a teaching vehicle, and the Fifth Avenue had partnered with the Seattle Police Department, and we're using it as a tool to talk to gangs and have gangs, or former gangbangers use it as a, kind of tipping point, to talk about gang activity, which is still, in many urban areas, still a very major and lethal problem. So I think kids recognize the passions of those characters and the feelings they have about each other. When you're a jet all the way. That kind of belonging to a group, that's something very important to young people. And then I think that the music is so absorbing that just, kind of seduces them further. I'm going to be very surprised if this Spielberg movie is not a hit. And I don't mean a critical hit. I don't know. I have no idea how it's going to turn out. But I think that many people will want to see it. I mean, I think it will have a big box office. Unlike some shows that were huge in the theater, and really did badly as films, like The Producers, and there are all kinds of examples of shows. Just a chorus line. Nobody I know except me has seen the movie version of a chorus line.
I have. Sadly.
Yeah, yes.
They need to do a remake of that. Please give us something new.
Right.
So, how has West Side Story, in your opinion, laid the groundwork for contemporary youth musicals of today, like Spring Awakening? And I rent even the new Sing Street, which I'm really excited to see when we ever can get back to the theater and to New York.
Yeah.
How did West Side Story lay the groundwork for these kind of?
Well, I have a whole chapter in my book about that, and there are a couple of things. It was the first real serious youth musical. I mean, a youth musical on Broadway, and especially in film, used to be, hey kids, let's put on a show. There are all kinds of movie musicals about that, especially from the 40s and 50s. And then there were these kind of, rock around the clock, The Girl Can't Help It kind of cheapy musicals with rock and roll and kids dancing. But it was a serious youth musical. It was, not a fun, just a, beach blankety kind of musical, obviously. And so was Hair, even though we think of it as this hippy dippy musical. I was struck the last time I saw Hair that it's an anti-war musical. I mean, it ends, with Let the Sun Shine In, but there's a large part of it is about this kid going off to die in Vietnam. And then we have Spring Awakening, which I think is another musical about generation gap and about young people struggling to grow up. It's quite different. It's based on the Frank Wiedekind play, but and then American Idiot. I put American Idiot in there too. So there was that. There was a kind of beginning of serious youth musicals. The other thing that I think is probably even more important, though, is that it really began the era of dance musicals, of musicals where, as I mentioned before, dance was not simply a kind of wonderful adornment that you put on, that you had to have a dance number and here and, a production number there. And, dance was a medium for storytelling. And so we get this wonderful lineage that I sort of traced. I mean, Michael Bennett, who choreographed, of course, to Dreamgirls and also Chorus Line. He was in an early, not real early, but he was in a touring version of West Side Story as a performer, and he knew Robbins. Susan Stroman was tremendously, influenced by Robbins, and has talked about it in interviews. Even someone like Tommy Tune, who you don't think of at all in the same way because his work was so different, was very influenced by him. So we've had this era of, and it's kind of gone by, but I hope it'll come back again, where choreographers are the auteurs of these musicals and are able to use dance in this much more serious way and much more narrative way. So I think that it had a tremendous influence there. And there's a whole lineage of people who you start with Robbins and go through. And in fact, for the book, I interviewed Peter Bull, who's the head of the Seattle Pacific Northwest Ballet. And he talked about being in the West Side Story dances, which is now a piece just with dancing and some songs, some singing, and an orchestra that many ballet companies do. New York City Ballet created one year as a kind of cash cow, thing. And, many other companies who follow the Balanchine method have taken that and used it again and again. So that's another place. Then there's this isn't dance, but the symphonic dances of West Side Story is a piece of music that is performed frequently by symphony orchestras. It's always a big hit. So, it's kind of infiltrated, it's kind of filtered through our lives in many ways.
Where does theater go from here? So many shows in New York, it was just announced yesterday that they're not going to come back until at least till after September, possibly longer, but they're doing refunds at least through Labor Day or so now. And that includes shows like this revival of West Side Story. So what do you think theater is going to look like on the other side of this pandemic? Is it ever going to be the same?
I don't know, Lauren. I mean, I think that's that's way above my pay grade. I think that we just don't know. We don't know how it will work with audiences, how it will work with performers being on stage together. I think the one thing I take heart in is that the Black Plague, the bubonic plague, which shut down British theaters for years, and which, was a big interruption in the career of William Shakespeare, but he managed to write a whole lot of great plays during that period. Somehow the theater came back, it came back. And it came back in spite of not just the plague, but the religious prohibition against theater that happened in England after the plague. So, I think it's going to take a lot of collective will and a lot of help from government and, backers, private money. And it's going to be, the longer it goes on, the harder it's going to be. That industry is so built on intimacy. The whole point of theater is intimacy between the audience and between the actors. And we're going to have to get to the point where we have a really good vaccine and people are not afraid to be together, before we can really bring the theater back. I
agree. I'm looking forward to that day because I miss live theater, but I also want it to be safe and prudent for us all to be together because I don't want to be thinking, are we going to get sick? I want to enjoy the show, and I know everybody else does too. So
the one thing that's different now that is a little concerning is that we're all relying on streaming entertainment and on screens for our entertainment. And, there's some concern, well, is that it? Are people going to be so scared of going out, or are they going to find it so inconvenient, that you have to drive somewhere, you have to park, or, you have to get a babysitter, all those things that make theater and live, performance more challenging. I just like to think that people are going to get kind of sick of just seeing formatted screen entertainment, that it's going to be kind of a revelation when we do get back to seeing people on stage performing music and theater and dance. But it's going to take, a lot of collective will to bring it back.
To make
if we go on for very long, I mean, if it's just, knock wood, if we actually can come back sometime this year, I think that will be a big victory, but I don't expect it. Do you? I mean,
no.
I
don't think so. I mean, I'd love to say, yes, we're all going to get back to it, but I think it's going to sadly be a long time. And when it does come back, I think it'll be very much a new normal, not what maybe we were used to before. I don't think we're going to have stage doors and, that kind of thing. I think it's going to be, you go to the theater and you leave and everyone's wearing a mask. I don't know, but I think it's going to look different, I guess.
Yeah.
Please show your book again, because like I said, my copy hasn't come in, but folks,
it's right. It's again called, it's easy to find it under the title, Something's Coming, Something Good, which is, of course, the first line of the song. And West Side Story, one of my favorites, and you can get it on Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, pretty much any place that sells books, you can get it.
Well, and
it's a fun read if you're a fan. It really.
Oh my gosh! And who's not a fan of West Side? I mean, if you like musical theater, chances are you probably like West Side Story. And I do have it listed on my website. We put together. People had asked me kind of to give top 10 book recommendations. And so your book is on there.
Thank you so much.
Recommendations. And maybe you'll come back and we can have another conversation.
Great.
After the movie comes out.
Oh, wonderful. That would be fun.
The movie.
I'm, fingers crossed. I hope it's good.
Well, and I'm going to show the beautiful picture again, because this just makes me happy. A whole bunch of people joined us late. So if you joined us late, all of this entire interview will be archived on Facebook, so you can watch it from the beginning. But at the beginning, we talked about these production photos, which were released in Vanity Fair and online and everywhere else. This is Ariana DeBose, who plays Anita in the Steven Spielberg movie. We in North Carolina know her as having grown up here and trained here for her early formative years. And so I'm very excited to see this movie, and these production photos just look amazing. So
she looks marvelous. Yes,
she does. So I can't wait. And we will talk again. Maybe we'll see each other again in November for our conference. Bill Hirschman's on here. He says, "Hey, Misha Berson." So he was.
What did he say?
He said hello.
Oh. Hi, Bill.
Bill is the former executive chairman of our American Theater Critics Association, and he and I had a wonderful conversation about the Florida theater scene last week. So I would encourage people to look at that one too. But thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's been fun.
This has been great. And I'd like to tell everyone watching, come back and join me tomorrow night at 5 p.m. I have to look at the calendar because I don't even know what day it is anymore, but I will be with Jerome Davis, who is the artistic director of Burning Coal Theater. And we're going to talk about how this crisis is affecting his theater in Raleigh and where he goes next, because they've got a great season plan too. So hopefully they'll be able to get to it. Thank you so much, Misha. Stay safe and healthy.
You too.
And we'll talk soon. I'm sure I'll have questions after I read the book in its entirety. So
I'm here. I'm not going anywhere.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for watching.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.